Hello, I'm Infamous Sphere. What's that? It's time for Infamous Queer!
Pride, 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 darling, darling, pride, pride 95!
Today I'm going to be talking about a mysterious condition that affects between 1 and 10% of the population, but is so ill understood that many people don't even think it exists. Yes, that's right. Today I'm going to be talking about bisexuality. Bisexuality is one of the 3 most basic categories of sexuality and fits very nicely into the Kinsey scale. However, despite the fact that it's very easy to understand, bisexuality is often misunderstood, ignored, or erased. Simply put, many people deal with their inability to understand bisexuals by pretending that they don't exist. While there's been quite a rise in LGBT representation in movies and television, there's one quite large and very obvious group that seems to have been left behind. Bisexual men. So why are bisexual men so rare as characters? What is it about male bisexuality that scares people? And why is it so much more threatening than female bisexuality? To think about this, we have to consider the 2 most prominent male bisexual characters at the moment. They're also 2 of the most unpleasant, immoral, and potentially evil male leads we've seen since the last Bret Easton Ellis adaptation, or before Dexter turned into a lumberjack. Yes, apparently it's more socially acceptable to be a dangerous criminal than to be a man interested in both sexes. It's time to talk about House of Cards and Halt and Catch Fire.
Everybody wants you when you're by, looking at the girls and eyeing all the guys.
Briefly put, House of Cards is a look at the machinations of a manipulative congressman working his way towards immense political power while destroying anyone stupid enough to get in his way. This delightful, charismatic and downright evil character is Frank Underwood, who is just the latest in a long line of violent, unpleasant and potentially repressed queer characters with more or less the same name. Yes, apparently if you want to avoid your child growing up to do any of that, I suggest that you don't call him Francis. Like some of the other Franks, Frank's sexuality is one of his few humanising characteristics. He's charming and ruthless, and has what appears to be an open relationship with his wife Claire, although he appears to hold her to different standards. Frank sleeps with a young journalist, Zoe Barnes, for a combination of simple sexual gratification and political influence. But when he meets with an alumni from his old university with whom he had a relationship, the 2 reminisce with genuine tenderness.
We were so close.
Like brothers.
More than brothers.
We were kids, Frank. We messed around a couple of times.
I was so drawn to you.
Later, he shows that his attraction to men isn't exactly something he's put behind him, but is in fact something he shares with Claire. However, Frank sees sexuality as no different to anything else. It's a tool, and he'll use it against other people if he needs to.
A great man once said that everything in life is about sex. Except sex. Sex is about power.
He doesn't seem to have any qualms or reservations about his own identity, although, as a Republican politician, he's hardly out. But his own attraction to men does not stop him from homophobic attacks on others when political need arises.
The most you'll ever make of yourself is blowing men like me. Men with real power. Yes, I can smell the cock on your breath from here.
You think you could get under my skin?
I know I can.
Frank is not someone who is ever going to care about LGBT rights, and would only consider coming out if it somehow furthered his own political interests. It's not even as if he considers his sexuality so personal that it can't be shared. It's more that he knows that knowledge is power, and when it comes to being a mentor or an example towards others, he really doesn't give a shit. Our other show is Halt and Catch Fire. Set in Texas, the show is a confusingly titled look at the race to develop better personal computers in the early 1980s. It has 4 main characters. Cameron, an intelligent young programmer with a terrible diet and difficult behaviour. Gordon, the dorky Dharma-spec software engineer with a recent history of crushed dreams. Donna, a skilled engineer who struggles with the need to put her career on hold to raise children and support Gordon, her husband. And finally, Joe McMillan, a man who knows next to nothing about computers, but is determined to sell the shit out of them. A salesman and an experienced bullshit artist, Joe is the catalyst that forces the characters into action, making them do things that they never would have thought themselves capable of. However, while the other three have their difficult moments, with Gordon being pathetic and selfish, and Cameron refusing to follow even the most basic of rules, Joe is the show's most unpleasant character. Joe might not be called frank, but like many other bisexual main characters, Joey is a manipulative liar who cares little for other people's feelings, blatantly uses sexuality as a tool to further his goals, resorts to violence whenever he can't get his own way, and secretly undermines his colleagues whenever they disagree with him.
You made the power surge happen, but you grabbed a bunch of random discs, didn't you? And demagnetized them all before swapping them for Cameron's?
Congrats, you got me.
And if I hadn't recovered the BIOS?
I would have saved the day myself before Kane left the building.
The man even lives in a creepy, empty American Psycho apartment, reflecting his complete inability to form attachments with things, let alone people. It's very easy to see Joe as a wholly negative representation of bisexual men. He habitually lies about his past, reinforcing the idea that bisexual men are manipulative liars.
Is this another lie?
Why do you care, Cameron? I mean, honestly.
Stop handling me. It's just a question.
But why do you care about the answer?
You want a piece of advice, Joe?
Not really.
Your whole thing, it attracts people, but it won't keep them around. Authenticity is what inspires people. If you want to lead people, you have to show them who you really are. Otherwise, you're just a $1,000 suit with nothing inside.
He seduces a woman's boyfriend, furthering the perception that bisexual men break up relationships and want to sleep with everyone. And he seems unable to form long-lasting emotional attachments to anyone. For bisexual men apparently can't make up their minds, are habitually promiscuous, and have a very unhealthy expression of their own sexuality. But in many ways, Joe McMillan is one of the best bisexual male characters we've got. His sexuality isn't seen as a phase, nor is it something he struggles with. And most importantly, we actually get to see it. While female bisexual characters tend to get their sexuality displayed, if not exploited, male bisexual characters very rarely exist, let alone are seen to do anything at all confirming their bisexuality. Joe may never say the words "I'm bisexual," but he is shown to have relationships and attraction to men and women, and is never portrayed as being unsure or in denial.
Did you sleep with Simon?
Is that something that would be a problem for you?
I don't give a shit that he's a man.
When Cameron finds out, she's not upset by Joe's sexuality, but is alarmed at the thought that she might be discarded like Joe's previous partner.
Did he tell you I left him?
Yeah, he did.
Did he tell you why? Because I told him I loved him. And the moment I said it, I knew it was over, so I left the next morning. I tried to spare myself the embarrassment. We did have quite a bit of fun for a while. Late nights. Did a lot of stupid things, but in the end, I believe Joe just got bored.
Joe might have a problem with relationships, but that problem affects his relationships with men and women alike.
Are you gonna get bored of me?
I don't know.
It also has to be acknowledged that the two Christophers in charge of this show made a more challenging decision by making Joe the queer character. It would have been more traditional and very easy to make Cameron queer instead. She's androgynous, young, sexually adventurous, and rebellious with a gender-neutral name. In other words, she fits quite a few stereotypes for queer women, and having her be the one who sought out same-gender partners would have been safer and more palatable. It's more accepted for a female character to be queer than a male one, and bisexuality, especially the kind of television or movie bisexuality that doesn't mention the word and seems to imply queer behaviour is just some kind of temporary experimentation before a reassuring return to heterosexuality, is the most acceptable form of female LGBT behaviour, as it ties in with the idea that the audience is always primarily heterosexual men, who want the thrill of seeing women together, without the fear that these women will permanently reject men.
You were a lesbian? At the time.
You still a lesbian?
No, I'm not still a lesbian.
You sure?
This has its own problems, and is an insulting way to view female bisexuality for sure, but it does mean that female bisexual characters are far more visible and far more likely to actively be bisexual than male ones are. It just comes down to this question. Is it more acceptable to be fetishised or to be marginalised completely? Here, finally, we have two bisexual male characters who aren't ignored, but are incredibly central to their own shows. But is visibility on its own good enough if these two characters aren't exactly positive? Granted, Frank Underwood and Joe McMillan fit in very nicely with the current crop of anti-hero male leads, and their negative aspects aren't really any worse than those of Walter White, Don Draper, Dexter or Hannibal. There's nothing particularly unusual about the way they express their sexuality, and it isn't portrayed more negatively than the sexuality of a heterosexual male lead. However, while their personality flaws aren't exactly unique to them, the negative aspects of their characterisation unfortunately align very well with pre-existing negative bisexual stereotypes. They hide themselves from others, they lie, they cheat, and they're horribly manipulative. Joe essentially steals a woman's boyfriend in order to undermine her. Frank has the closest thing to a stable relationship, as he and his wife are essentially partners in crime, but Joe is as indecisive and unable to commit as any negative bisexual stereotype. Since his show is set in the 80s, he must also deal with the stigma of bisexual men being viewed as vectors of contagion, spreading what was seen as a gay disease to the straight community.
You know, we must have seen 20 pretty titties. Not so much as a smile from you. What are you, queer?
And while they get the opportunity and the time to express their bisexual sexuality, they never outwardly describe themselves as bisexual.
If I want someone, I want them. It's attraction.
While we're on the topic of negative portrayals, while Frank and Joe's relationships with men are given narrative importance, they aren't really treated equally to their straight relationships. While both of the men have had at least one important same-sex relationship, conveniently, both of these relationships were several years in the past, meaning that we get reminiscences rather than passion. At least there's no implication that the men grew out of their same-sex attraction, but while both of the characters are frequently shown in the act of heterosexual rutting, anything queer gets a tasteful fade to black. While it's better than these relationships and liaisons never being shown or mentioned, it still shows that there's a real double standard between depicting heterosexual sexuality and queer sexuality, particularly if it's between two men. You could very easily argue that Frank Underwood and Joe McMillan's unpleasant behaviour shouldn't be taken as a criticism of bisexual men as a whole. For after all, bisexual men are men like any other, and shouldn't necessarily be held to a higher standard. Why shouldn't there be bi characters who are just bad people? After all, television viewers love bad people, and almost every other character in either show is just as flawed and morally compromised as Frank and Joe. But while having flawed, complex queer characters that aren't perfect aligns very well with the idea of good queer representation, the problem comes when these deeply unpleasant queer characters are the only representation there is. While there are many different kinds of lesbians and gay men on TV who run the gamut from being heroically virtuous to petty and vindictive, these are the only kinds of bisexual men we have. Much like cruising, the characters themselves aren't offensive, but the context definitely is. If these are the only kind of bisexual men that the world at large sees, then negative perceptions of bisexual men will only continue. Representation is incredibly important. It's bizarre to think that a sexual identity that is so basic, so simple, and so common is still struggling to be understood and reflected back on screen. Yes, this does have a lot to do with the fact that bisexuality is arguably harder to show with the respect given to heterosexuality and homosexuality. It takes longer to establish that a character has an interest in both men and women, without one gender being given vastly more importance than the other. If handled wrongly, bisexuality can come across as the character being in a phase, or having a strange crazy moment that will then never be mentioned again, or being gay and closeted.
You know, I did the date the bisexual guy thing in college, but in the end, they all ended up with men.
So did the bisexual women.
I'm not even sure bisexuality exists. I think it's just a layover on the way to Gay Town.
However, it's almost as if film and television creators are terrified of the word bisexual itself. Forget the actions of the characters. If no one ever identifies themselves as bisexual on screen, this puts bisexuality in the position of somehow not being considered a legitimate identity, much like homosexuality was in the past. Not every bi character has to be waving their specific pride flag, and not every bi character has to be perfect, moral and heroic, but by having more and more bisexual characters who outwardly identify themselves as bisexual without being terrified of the word, people will begin to understand bisexuality as something that, might actually exist. But what about the shows themselves? Should you watch them? Both House of Cards and Halt and Catch Fire are very engaging and are well directed with excellent atmosphere. Even though I can't say I'm an expert on either the American political system or on early personal computer programming and development, both shows are easy enough to follow for lay people to watch and complex enough to keep all viewers interested. I prefer the latter somewhat, as House of Cards can be a bit exhausting, with its constant barrage of never-ending nastiness, whereas Halt and Catch Fire has some genuinely kind characters in it, who wouldn't think of stabbing each other in the back. Both shows do okay in terms of female representation, although they take place in more male-dominated environments. But in both shows, female characters are clearly shown to be imperfect and interesting, but have influence and power and are taken seriously. The important thing is that by making their male leads bisexual, both shows have taken a risk and haven't seemed to have suffered for it. I can only hope that more shows and movies follow in their lead and improve on what they have done, for more bisexual characters in leading roles can't be anything other than a good thing. So that was House of Cards and Halt and Catch Fire. And now, if you'll excuse me, I've got to go. I've just got a new idea for DC number plates.
And no man can call himself complete till he's seen it from both sides.